It was supposed to be the perfect road trip. Lily and her friends, a group of 5 college students, had been planning this trip for months. They had mapped out the best routes, packed up their camping gear, and were excited for the adventure ahead. They wanted to explore the open roads, escape the monotony of everyday life, and experience nature's beauty firsthand. The only thing they didn't plan for was the nightmare that awaited them on a desolate, forgotten highway. The journey started smoothly. The sun was shining, the music was playing, and the conversations were light-hearted. But as they drove deeper into the mountains, something began to feel off. The roads became narrower, and the familiar signs of civilization began to fade into nothingness. The group, unaware of the danger lurking ahead, continued driving, pushing forward as they crossed into a region where no one had any cell service. As nightfall approached, Lily suggested they pull over and camp for the night in a secluded area they had found on the map. It was peaceful, surrounded by tall trees and the distant sounds of wildlife. But once they set up their tents and sat around the campfire, an unsettling quiet began to fall over them. There was no breeze, no crickets, just an eerie stillness. Lily noticed the air felt heavier, as if something was watching them. But when she asked her friends, they laughed it off, chalking it up to the creepy vibes of being so deep in the wilderness. They tried to distract themselves with stories, but as they spoke, they realized that the forest around them was unusually silent. No animals, no sounds of nature, just complete silence. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the trees. It was a screech followed by a thud, like something large had fallen to the ground. Everyone froze. They turned to look at each other, questioning what it could have been. But there was nothing visible in the darkness. The air felt colder, and the hairs on the back of Lily's neck stood on end. The group decided to pack up their things and drive to the nearest town. But when they got back to their car, they noticed something strange. The car's tires were slashed. Panicking, Lily and her friends looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The closest town was miles away, and they didn't have the means to fix the car. As they gathered their thoughts, one of them, Mark, suggested they walk along the road and try to flag down help. They started down the path, but the moment they stepped into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop drastically. As they walked, the silence grew more intense, but then something caught their attention. A set of headlights in the distance. They rushed to the side of the road, desperate for help. But as the vehicle came closer, it slowed and came to a stop in front of them. The driver, a man with a weathered face, rolled down the window. He smiled, but the smile was unsettling, unnaturally wide and stretched. His eyes were cold, hollow, almost lifeless. Without saying a word, the driver gestured for them to get in. They hesitated but knew they had no choice. The man turned around and drove them deeper into the forest, the road growing narrower as they traveled further from civilization. As they drove, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She tried to make small talk with the driver, but he remained silent, only occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror. Then, the car suddenly stopped. The driver's smile faded, and he turned to them with a blank stare. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. The group, terrified, looked around to find they were surrounded by nothing but dense trees and darkness. The road ahead was blocked by a fallen tree, and there was no other way out. The friends scrambled to get out of the car, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows were stuck, and the man's gaze grew colder, more sinister. panic set in as the group realized they were trapped. Just as the driver started to reach for something in his jacket, a sudden screeching sound filled the air. The unmistakable sound of a tire being deflated. Then a voice, deep and distant, called from the trees, "Leave them, they're not meant to escape." Suddenly, the car doors unlocked. Without thinking, Lily and her friends ran into the woods, not knowing where they were going, but certain that they had to get as far away from the man as possible. They ran until they couldn't hear the car anymore, until their lungs burned and their legs felt like jelly. Eventually, they stumbled upon a small town. They were shaken, covered in dirt and scratches, but they were alive. When they tried to tell the authorities what had happened, they were met with blank stares. No one had heard of the road, and the town's people looked at them like they were crazy. But when they asked about the man, the locals' faces turned pale. "No one goes down that road anymore," they said. "People who do don't come back." The friends never spoke of that night again. But sometimes when Lily closes her eyes, she can still hear the screeching tire and the distant voice calling out to her from the darkness. It all began on a quiet Friday evening. Rayan and Megan packed their car, excited for a weekend getaway. The plan was simple: drive through the scenic countryside, camp under the stars, and escape the noise of the city. Little did they know, they were driving straight into the unknown. The sun had already set by the time they reached the long, isolated highway that cut through miles of empty farmland. The road was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. The only sound was the hum of their engine and the occasional rustle of wind outside. As they drove deeper into the night, Megan spotted something up ahead. A man was standing on the side of the road, waving for help. His clothes were dirty, and he looked exhausted, like he'd been stranded for hours. Rayan hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he would normally do, but Megan insisted. "We can't just leave him out here," she said. Reluctantly, Rayan pulled over. The man introduced himself as Tom, explaining that his car had broken down a few miles back. He seemed harmless enough, so they agreed to give him a ride to the nearest gas station. At first, everything seemed normal. Tom was quiet but polite, thanking them repeatedly for stopping. But as the drive continued, things started to feel off. He kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, his eyes lingering just a little too long. Megan noticed it first. She nudged Rayan and whispered, "Is it just me, or is he acting strange?" Rayan shrugged it off, but the uneasy feeling was growing. Something about Tom didn't sit right. He didn't seem nervous or scared like someone who had been stranded. In fact, he seemed too calm, almost too comfortable. About 20 minutes into the drive, Tom asked them to take a detour. "The gas station is just a little off the main road," he said. But when Rayan checked the GPS, there was no gas station anywhere nearby. The tension in the car was palpable as Rayan and Megan exchanged nervous glances. Suddenly, Tom's demeanor changed. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a cold, unsettling expression. "You should have kept driving," he said, his voice low and menacing. Before they could react, Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. "Turn down that road now," he ordered. Rayan's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing for a way out. Megan, sitting in the passenger seat, tried to stay calm, but fear had paralyzed her. Rayan knew they couldn't let Tom take control, so he made a split-second decision. Instead of turning, he slammed on the brakes, throwing Tom off balance. "Run!" Rayan shouted to Megan as he threw open his door. Megan didn't hesitate. They bolted into the dark fields on either side of the road, their hearts pounding as they ran blindly through the tall grass. Behind them, they could hear Tom yelling, his footsteps growing louder as he chased them. For what felt like hours, they ran, adrenaline keeping them moving even as exhaustion set in. Eventually, the shouts faded and they collapsed in a clearing, trying to catch their breath. But their relief was short-lived. In the distance, they could see a faint light. Headlights. Tom had gone back to the car and was driving slowly through the fields, searching for them. Rayan and Megan knew they couldn't outrun a car. Desperate, they hid behind a cluster of trees, praying the headlights wouldn't reveal their location. The car crept closer, the engine humming softly as it crawled through the field. Then it stopped. The headlights went out, and the darkness swallowed everything. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Megan clutched Rayan's arm, trying to stay as quiet as possible. They could hear Tom's voice now, soft but chilling. "You can't hide forever," he said, his tone almost playful. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. Rayan held his breath, his heart racing so loudly, he thought Tom might hear it. But then, miraculously, the footsteps moved away. Tom must have decided to look elsewhere. When they were sure he was gone, Rayan and Megan made their way back to the road. They walked for miles until they finally saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Another car, this time with a family inside. They flagged it down, and the driver called the police. When the authorities arrived and searched the area, they found no trace of Tom or his car. Rayan and Megan never took another road trip after that night. They had escaped with their lives, but the memory of Tom's cold, piercing eyes and the sound of his voice still haunts them. Emma and Jack had been dating for 2 years and decided to celebrate their anniversary with a cross-country road trip. They were on their way to visit a small mountain town known for its serene views and cozy cabins. The drive had been uneventful, filled with laughter, snacks, and their favorite playlists. But as the sun began to set, their GPS started acting up. The map froze, and the directions wouldn't load. They were now deep in the countryside, surrounded by empty fields and dense forests. Despite the growing unease, Jack assured Emma they were on the right path. As the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, relief washed over them when they spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. Gas station, open 24 hours. The building was old, with peeling paint and a single pump that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. A dim yellow light illuminated the front entrance, but the rest of the area was shrouded in darkness. Creepy, but it's better than running out of gas, Jack joked, trying to lighten the mood. Emma forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine as they pulled up. Jack stepped out to pump the gas while Emma stayed in the car, scrolling through her phone in frustration, still trying to fix the GPS. A few minutes later, Jack returned, looking puzzled. "It's not working. I'm going to ask someone inside," he said. Emma watched as he walked into the dimly lit station. The door creaked open, then shut behind him. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Emma's anxiety grew with every second. What was taking him so long? Finally, unable to wait any longer, she decided to go in after him. As she stepped into the station, the smell of damp wood and stale air hit her. The interior was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows. The shelves were lined with dusty cans and outdated snacks, but Jack was nowhere to be seen. "Jack!" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She walked towards the counter, where an old man with a blank expression stood behind the register. His eyes were dull, almost lifeless, as he stared straight ahead. "Excuse me," Emma said nervously. "My boyfriend came in here. Have you seen him?" The man didn't answer. He just pointed to a door in the back, his hand trembling slightly. Emma hesitated, but her concern for Jack overpowered her fear. She pushed open the door and found herself in a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The air grew colder as she moved forward. At the end of the hall was another door, slightly ajar. Inside, she could hear faint whispers, like voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. "Jack," she called again, stepping closer. As she pushed the door open, the whispers stopped abruptly. The room was empty, except for a single chair and an old mirror hanging on the wall. But something about the reflection wasn't right. She froze. In the mirror, she saw herself, but behind her stood Jack, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. She spun around, but there was no one there. Panicking, Emma stumbled back into the hallway, only to find it had changed. The once narrow hall now stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were darker, almost black, and the air felt suffocating. She tried to retrace her steps, but found herself back at the same door with the mirror. Her reflection was no longer her own. It was a distorted version of her, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing all around her. Suddenly she felt a hand grab her shoulder. She screamed and turned to see Jack, his face contorted in terror. "We need to leave, now," he said, his voice shaking. They ran through the hallway, which seemed to shift and twist with every step. Doors appeared and disappeared, the whispers growing louder and more menacing. Finally, they burst through the front door of the gas station, collapsing onto the pavement. To their shock, the gas station was gone. They were standing in the middle of the empty road, their car parked a few feet away. The neon sign, the pump, the old man, everything had vanished. Without saying a word, they got into the car and sped away, not stopping until they reached the nearest town. When they told the locals about the gas station, their faces turned pale. "That place hasn't existed for over 50 years, one of them said. "It burned down after, well, let's just say people don't talk about it anymore." Emma and Jack never spoke of the incident again. But sometimes, when Emma looks into a mirror, she swears she can still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable. Laura and her group were on their way to a music festival in Nevada. It was a trip they had planned for months, with everything perfectly coordinated. They decided to split into 2 cars, Laura and Mike in one, and their friends Tina, Eric, and Sarah in the other. The drive through the desert was long, but the group kept in touch over walkie-talkies to share jokes and keep each other awake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, they noticed how empty the road had become. No other cars, no streetlights, just endless stretches of sand and the faint silhouette of mountains in the distance. "Feels like we're the only ones out here," Eric's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. "Yeah, kind of creepy, huh?" Laura replied, laughing nervously. As night fell, the group decided to take a quick break at a rest stop. But when they reached the location on their map, it was nothing more than a dilapidated structure with a few broken down cars in the lot. A rusted sign hung loosely from a post, swaying in the desert wind. Let's just keep driving, Tina suggested. This place feels wrong. The group agreed, deciding to push through to the next town. Little did they know, they would never make it there. As they continued driving, Laura noticed something strange in her rearview mirror. The car carrying Tina, Eric, and Sarah seemed to lag behind, even though they had been driving closely together. "Hey, are you guys okay back there?" Laura asked through the walkie-talkie. Static. She repeated the question, but only silence followed. Then, out of nowhere, Eric's voice came through, distorted and filled with static. "We can't see." The transmission cut off. "What do you mean you can't see?" Mike asked, gripping the walkie-talkie tightly. But there was no response. Laura slowed the car, waiting for their friends to catch up. But as they looked back, the headlights of the second car flickered and then vanished completely. "What the hell?" Mike whispered, panic creeping into his voice. They pulled over, hearts pounding, and waited. The desert was eerily silent, the only sound the faint whistle of the wind. Laura turned on her phone's flashlight and stepped out of the car, scanning the darkness. "Tina? Eric? Sarah?" she called out. Her voice echoed into the void, but there was no answer. Mike got out as well, shining his flashlight down the road. "Maybe they broke down," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They decided to drive back the way they came, expecting to find their friends stranded on the roadside. But as they retraced their route, there was no sign of the car. No skid marks, no signs of an accident. It was as if the vehicle had simply disappeared. Desperate, Laura and Mike called the police, who promised to send a patrol car. Hours passed, but no help arrived. Even worse, the phones lost all signal, leaving them completely cut off. Determined to find their friends, they continued searching, driving further into the desert. That's when they saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Thinking it might be the missing car, they sped toward it. As they got closer, the glow took on an unnatural quality, shifting colors and flickering like a flame in the wind. In the middle of the desert stood a massive circular structure made of stone, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Laura and Mike stepped out, drawn to the strange monument. On the ground near its base were three familiar objects: Eric's phone, Tina's scarf, and Sarah's bracelet. "What is this place?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. Before Mike could respond, the wind picked up, carrying with it a low, droning hum. The glow from the structure grew brighter, casting long shadows across the sand. And then they heard it. Faint voices calling their names, coming from inside the monument. "Laura, Mike." It was their friends' voices, distorted and hollow, like they were speaking from the other side of a vast chasm. Mike grabbed Laura's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to run, the ground beneath them began to shake. A blinding light erupted from the monument, and for a moment, everything went silent. When the light faded, the structure was gone, and so was the desert road. Laura and Mike woke up in their car, parked on the side of an empty highway. The sun was rising, painting the desert in soft hues of pink and gold. Their phones were working again, but there was no sign of their friends. When they reported the incident to the authorities, they were met with skepticism. No one had seen a second car. No one knew of a glowing monument. And there was no evidence their friends had ever been with them. To this day, Laura and Mike are haunted by that night. Were their friends taken by something beyond this world? Or did they stumble upon a place humans were never meant to find? It was past midnight, and aside from their car, the highway seemed deserted. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind passed through the trees. Lucy yawned, glancing at her phone. "Another hour to go," she said. "Think you'll make it?" Mark chuckled. "I'm good. Just keep me company, okay?" They drove on in companionable silence, the road ahead illuminated by their headlights. But as they rounded a curve, Lucy suddenly gasped, "Mark, slow down!" Standing in the middle of the road was a man, waving his arms frantically. He was wearing a torn hoodie and jeans, his face pale and gaunt under the harsh beam of the headlights. Mark hit the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt just a few feet from the stranger. "Is he okay?" Lucy whispered, her voice tinged with unease. The man approached the driver's side window, his movements jittery and desperate. Mark rolled the window down slightly. "Please, you have to help me," the man begged. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours." Mark hesitated, glancing at Lucy. She shook her head subtly, her instincts warning her against letting the stranger into their car. But Mark, always the helpful type, nodded. "Get in. We'll take you to the nearest town," he said, unlocking the back door. The man climbed in, slamming the door shut behind him. As they resumed driving, Lucy couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. The stranger sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window. His breathing was shallow, almost labored. "So, where's your car?" Mark asked, trying to break the tension. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring out the window. "Hey, are you okay?" Mark asked again, louder this time. The man finally turned to them, his face obscured by shadows. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, in a low, guttural voice. "What?" Mark asked, confused. "You shouldn't have stopped," the man repeated. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, even though it had been turned off. A distorted voice echoed through the car, repeating the words, "You shouldn't have stopped." Lucy's heart raced as the temperature in the car seemed to drop. She turned to look at the man again, but he was gone. The back seat was empty. "What the hell?" Mark exclaimed, pulling the car over. They both got out, shining their phone flashlights into the back seat. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. But before they could process what had happened, a loud bang echoed from the forest beside them. Mark and Lucy froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "Get in the car," Lucy whispered urgently. They scrambled back into the car, locking the doors. Mark floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the gravel before finding traction. As they sped down the highway, Lucy glanced in the side mirror and screamed. Running after them was the man, his face twisted into an unnatural grin, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "No way, no way!" Mark shouted, gripping the wheel tightly. No matter how fast they drove, the man seemed to keep pace, his figure illuminated by the taillights. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Breathing heavily, Mark and Lucy didn't stop until they reached the next gas station. The brightly lit convenience store felt like a sanctuary after the terror they had just experienced. They hurried inside, explaining what had happened to the clerk, a middle-aged man with a kind face. As they spoke, the clerk's expression darkened. "You said this happened on Highway 41?" he asked. Mark and Lucy nodded. The clerk sighed, shaking his head. "You're not the first ones to see him. Years ago, a man broke down on that stretch of road. He tried flagging down cars, but no one stopped for him. He was hit by a truck and died instantly. Lucy's blood ran cold. "But we picked him up," she stammered. The clerk gave them a grim look. "That's what he wants. He's always looking for someone to stop." Mark and Lucy left the gas station in silence, their minds racing. They avoided Highway 41 for the rest of their lives, but neither could forget the chilling grin of the man who had vanished from their car. Thanks for watching. Which story creeped you out the most? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to Dark Whisper for more terrifying tales. Drive safe and stay alert. See you in the next one.